Put your hands where I can see them, now. The command cut through the late afternoon air, sharp enough to make nearby conversations collapse into silence. Danielle Carter paused beside her car, one hand still gripping a paper grocery bag, the other resting lightly on the door handle. For a brief second, nothing moved. Then an orange slipped free from the torn edge of the bag and dropped, bouncing once before rolling slowly across the damp concrete, leaving a faint trail of water behind it. The parking lot lights flickered on overhead, casting a cold, pale glow that reflected off windshields and phone screens now quietly rising from every direction. She turned, calm, measured, her expression unreadable, meeting the officer's gaze without urgency, without fear. Officer Ryan Blake stepped closer, his posture rigid, his tone already decided before a single question had been asked. Step away from the vehicle. His hand hovered near his radio, eyes scanning her like he was reading a report only he could see. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't rush. She simply set the grocery bag down, carefully, as if the fragile eggs inside mattered more than the tension building around her. Another orange rolled free, joining the first, circling slowly before coming to rest near the painted white line of the parking space. A car engine idled somewhere behind them, then shut off. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. There must be some mistake, she said quietly, her voice even, steady enough to almost disappear under the hum of distant traffic. Blake didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at his partner, Officer Mason Cole, who had already positioned himself a few steps behind her, closing off the open space without saying a word. Vehicle matches a report, Blake said finally. And you fit the description. The words landed flat, rehearsed, like they'd been used 100 times before. Danielle's eyes flickered, not in panic, but in recognition, as if she had heard that exact sentence in a different place, in a different year, spoken with the same quiet certainty. She let out a slow breath, barely visible in the cooling evening air. Around them, people had started to gather, not close enough to interfere, but close enough to witness. A woman near the cart return held her phone chest high, recording. A man leaned against his truck, arms crossed, watching without expression. Somewhere, a child asked a question that went unanswered. Blake stepped in closer. Turn around. There was no hesitation in his voice now, only procedure. Danielle complied, slowly, placing her hands behind her back. The metal clicked into place, tight, precise, final. The sound echoed louder than it should have, like something larger than the moment itself had just been locked in. She didn't react, didn't pull away. Her gaze drifted briefly downward, catching the reflection of herself in a nearby car door, distorted, fractured by the curve of the metal. For a split second, her hand shifted, and a small detail caught the overhead light. A simple silver ring, engraved, official, but unnoticed by anyone who mattered in that moment. Blake adjusted his stance, already turning away, already moving forward. You people always say that, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to exist, not loud enough to be challenged. Danielle lifted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice softer now, almost lost in the air between them. And you always think you're right. Neither of them knew yet that by this time tomorrow, everything about this moment would look different. The metal cuff stayed cold against Danielle Carter's wrists as Officer Blake guided her toward the patrol car, his grip firm but controlled, like he had already filed her away in his mind as just another routine stop, another line in a report that would be forgotten by morning. And yet the air around them felt anything but routine. It felt heavy, suspended, like the entire parking lot was holding its breath without knowing why. And Danielle walked without resistance, her steps steady, measured, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of the moment belonged to someone else entirely, as if she had already stepped outside of it and was simply watching it unfold from a distance. And behind her the forgotten groceries remained scattered across the asphalt, oranges. Resting near the painted lines, a carton tipped on its side, eggs cracked but unnoticed, while the low hum of whispers began to build, quiet at first, then layering over itself as more people gathered, drawn not by noise but by the silence that followed it, the kind of silence that made people look twice, that made them pause mid-step and reach instinctively for their phones. And somewhere to the left a woman spoke under her breath, not loud enough to interrupt, but loud enough to travel. That Does not look right. And no one answered her. Not because they disagreed, but because no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And Officer Mason Cole opened the back door of the patrol car, the hinge creaking slightly, the interior dark compared to the fading daylight. And Blake gave a small nod, a silent instruction, and Danielle lowered herself into the seat without hesitation, careful, composed, as if she were entering a place she had already accepted she needed to be, and the door closed with a firm, echoing sound that seemed to ripple outward, sharper than it should have been. And for a moment, everything stilled again. And inside the car, Danielle shifted her hands slightly, the cuffs adjusting with a soft metallic sound. And her gaze moved to the window, catching fragments of movement outside, reflections of faces, blurred shapes, the glow of screens capturing something they did not fully understand yet. And she watched them the way someone watches rain hit glass, detached but aware. And Blake remained outside for a second longer, scanning the area, his expression tight, controlled. But there was something else now, something small and unspoken, a flicker of uncertainty that passed too quickly to be acknowledged. And Cole stepped closer to him, lowering his voice just enough to stay between them. "You sure about this?" And Blake did not answer immediately, his eyes briefly landing on the scattered groceries, then on the small group of onlookers who had not moved, and finally back on the car. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of procedure, not doubt. "We follow the report," he said, as if repeating it made it solid, made it enough. And Cole nodded, but slower this time, less certain. And in the distance a car pulled into the lot and slowed as the driver noticed the scene, headlights sweeping across the pavement, briefly illuminating the silver ring still visible on Danielle's finger, catching the light for just a second longer than anything else, bright, deliberate, but still unseen by the people who needed to see it most. And inside the car, Danielle exhaled quietly, her breath steady, her expression unchanged, but her eyes shifted again, not toward the officers, not toward the crowd, but toward something deeper, something internal, like she was measuring the moment not by what it was, but by what it would become. And somewhere behind the line of parked cars, a voice rose slightly above the others, uncertain, hesitant. "I think I have seen her before." And the words lingered in the air, not loud enough to stop what was happening, but enough to begin changing it, even if no one realized it yet. The patrol car engine started with a low hum that seemed louder than usual, vibrating through the frame as Officer Blake finally stepped into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, sealing off the outside noise, but not the tension that had already settled inside. And for a moment neither officer spoke, the silence stretching thin between them like something fragile, something waiting to break. While in the back seat, Danielle Carter sat upright, her hands resting calmly in her lap despite the cuffs, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had already accepted the rhythm of this moment and refused to let it rush her. And through the window, she watched the parking lot begin to move again, slowly, like a scene resuming after being paused, people stepping away but still looking back, still recording, still unsure what they had just witnessed. And one figure remained near the edge of the frame, an older woman holding her phone lower now, her expression tighter, more focused, as if something about this did not sit right, as if she was trying to place a face she knew she had seen somewhere before. And inside the car, Officer Mason Cole shifted slightly in his seat, glancing back through the divider, his eyes lingering on Danielle for a second longer than necessary before turning forward again. "Dispatch confirmed?" he asked, his voice quieter this time, less certain. And Blake nodded once, eyes fixed ahead as he pulled the car into motion, the tires rolling over the damp pavement with a soft hiss. "Plate came back flagged earlier," he said, though his tone carried less conviction than before, as if repeating the information was no longer enough to fully settle it. And Cole leaned back, exhaling slowly. "She does not seem like..." He stopped himself, the sentence unfinished, because there was no acceptable way to complete it without questioning everything they had already done. And Blake tightened his grip on the steering wheel just slightly, enough to be felt but not seen. "Looks do not matter," he replied, but the words sounded thinner now, less like a rule and more like something he needed to believe. And in the back seat, Danielle's gaze shifted again, this time catching the reflection of the officers in the rearview mirror, distorted but clear enough to read the tension in their faces, the small cracks forming beneath their certainty. And she watched them the way she had watched many before, not with anger, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that came from experience, from knowing how moments like this unfolded, how assumptions hardened into actions, and how those actions eventually circled back to demand an answer. And she spoke again, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the low hum of the engine. "You are going to want to check that report again." And this time neither officer responded immediately, because something in the way she said it was different, not defensive, not pleading, but certain, like she was stating a fact that had not yet been discovered. And Blake's eyes flickered briefly to the mirror, meeting hers for just a fraction of a second before looking away. But that moment lingered longer than it should have. Long enough to plant doubt where there had been none before. And as the patrol car turned onto the main road, merging into the steady flow of evening traffic, a notification sound broke through the silence. Sharp and unexpected, coming from the dashboard system, and Cole leaned forward slightly, glancing at the screen as new information began to load, his expression shifting almost instantly, not into panic, but into something quieter, heavier, the kind of realization that arrives too late to stop what has already begun. And he did not speak right away, not because he did not want to, but because he needed a second to be sure. And outside the sky darkened just a little more, the last light of day, fading behind the buildings, while inside the car the truth moved closer, one silent update at a time. The notification stayed on the screen longer than it should have, glowing faintly against the darkening dashboard as Officer Mason Cole leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the lines of text once, then again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change if he gave it another second. But it did not. It only became clearer, heavier, and his hand hovered near the console without touching anything. Like even the smallest movement might make it more real, and beside him Officer Ryan Blake kept his eyes on the road. But his focus had already shifted, pulled toward the silence that had settled inside the car, the kind of silence that did not come from calm, but from something unraveling beneath the surface, and the steady rhythm of the tires against the asphalt seemed louder now, each rotation marking time that could not be taken back. And finally Cole spoke, his voice lower than before, not questioning this time, but careful, deliberate. "Ryan, you need to look at this." And Blake did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as he kept driving, as if delaying the moment might somehow delay the consequence. But the silence stretched too far, and he glanced over, just long enough to read the first line, and that was all it took, because the words did not leave room for interpretation. They did not soften themselves or wait to be understood. They simply existed, clear and final. And something shifted in his expression, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, like a crack forming in something that had always felt solid. And he looked forward again, but this time, his grip on the steering wheel changed, tighter, more controlled, like he was holding on to something that was already slipping. And in the back seat Danielle Carter watched the reflection in the mirror once more, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. But there was a quiet awareness now, a recognition of the moment arriving exactly where she had expected it to go, not with chaos, not with raised voices, but with a slow, undeniable realization. And she did not speak again, because she did not need to. The truth was already doing that for her. And Cole swallowed lightly, his gaze still fixed on the screen. The plate was flagged, but it was cleared an hour ago, he said, each word landing heavier than the last. System update did not push through in time. And the sentence hung there, unfinished in meaning but complete in consequence. And Blake exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but deeper than before, like he was trying to steady something internal, something that had begun to shift beyond his control. And for a brief second he glanced at the rearview mirror again, meeting Danielle's eyes. And this time he did not look away immediately, because what he saw there was not fear, not anger, but something far more difficult to face. It was certainty, calm, unshaken certainty, the kind that did not argue because it did not need to. And he broke eye contact first, turning his attention back to the road. But the road felt different now, narrower somehow, like every lane led to the same unavoidable place. And outside the city lights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the windshield, while inside the car the air felt tighter, heavier, filled with everything that had not yet been said, and Cole shifted again, his voice quieter now, almost careful. We should verify her identity. And Blake nodded once, but slower, his earlier confidence replaced by something more deliberate, more cautious. And as he reached toward the radio, his hand paused just slightly, a fraction of a second that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by Danielle, because she had seen that pause before. She had seen it in courtrooms, in testimonies, in moments where people realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. And she finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, unchanged. Yes, she said softly. You should. And the words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, leaving no room for anything but what was coming next. Blake's hand hovered over the radio for a fraction longer than it should have, the soft static already whispering through the speaker, as if it were waiting for him to decide which version of the truth he was about to confirm. And for the first time since the moment in the parking lot, his movements were no longer automatic, no longer guided purely by procedure, but slowed by something heavier, something that made every action feel deliberate. And beside him Cole sat still, eyes forward now, but no longer seeing the road, only replaying the lines on the screen, the timing, the update that had come too late, and how easily it had all happened anyway. And in the back seat Danielle Carter remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, not watching them directly now, but watching the space between them, the silence, the hesitation, the shift that had already begun to reshape the moment. And Blake finally pressed the button, his voice controlled but tighter than before. Dispatch. Confirm identity on detained individual. And the words left his mouth with a weight they had not carried earlier, because now they were not just a formality, they were a test. And the radio crackled, a brief pause. Then a response began to form on the other end, filtered through distance and protocol. And in that short gap of waiting, the car seemed to slow even though the speedometer had not changed, time stretching just enough to make room for doubt to settle in fully. And Danielle's eyes closed briefly, not in resignation, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement, like someone recognizing the exact point where a story changes direction. And when she opened them again, they were calm, unchanged, as if she had already accepted whatever came next long before this moment ever arrived. And the voice on the radio returned, clearer now, more certain. Unit 12, confirm name. And Blake hesitated, just slightly, his eyes flickering once more to the mirror, meeting Danielle's gaze again. And this time there was no resistance in it, no dismissal, only the quiet realization that the balance of the situation had shifted, even if nothing visible had changed yet. And he swallowed lightly, the sound barely audible, before speaking again. Name is Danielle Carter. And the words felt different now, heavier, more specific, like they carried more meaning than they had just minutes ago. And the radio went silent for a beat longer than expected. And in that silence Cole's fingers tightened slightly against his knee, while Blake kept his eyes forward, but no longer saw the road the same way. And then the response came, sharp, immediate, unmistakable. Stand by. And something in the tone made both officers straighten just a little, not out of discipline, but out of instinct. Because that tone did not belong to routine checks, it belonged to something else, something larger. And the car continued forward under the glow of streetlights, each one passing overhead like a slow countdown. And Danielle shifted slightly in her seat, the cuffs making a soft sound again, but her posture remained steady, her expression composed, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment while they were still catching up to it. And the radio crackled again, louder this time, cutting through the silence with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Unit 12, be advised. Danielle Carter is a federal district court judge. And the words did not echo, they did not repeat, they simply landed, heavy and final, filling the space inside the car with a kind of silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything that had just changed. And Blake's grip tightened instinctively before loosening again, his breath catching just slightly before he steadied it, while Cole turned his head slowly, not toward Blake, but toward the back seat, his expression no longer uncertain but fully aware now. And Danielle met his gaze calmly, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. And for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing left to question, only what came next. and outside the city lights continued to pass, unchanged, while inside the car everything had already shifted into something they could not undo. The words did not fade after the radio went silent. They stayed in the air inside the car, heavy and unmoving, as if they had changed the temperature itself, and for a moment no one reached for anything, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question, only the reality of what had already been done, and Officer Ryan Blake kept his eyes forward, but he was no longer driving the same way. His hands looser on the wheel now, his posture no longer rigid but held together by effort, as if he was trying to maintain control over something that had already slipped past him. And beside him Mason Cole exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness, his gaze shifting once more toward the back seat, not quickly, not nervously, but with the kind of awareness that comes when a moment reshapes itself into something irreversible. And Danielle Carter sat exactly as she had before, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap despite the cuffs, her expression unchanged, not distant, not cold, just calm, the kind of calm that does not come from comfort but from understanding. And the city lights moved across her face in soft intervals as the car passed beneath them, brief flashes of brightness followed by shadow, like time marking itself in quiet beats. And Blake finally broke the silence, his voice controlled but different now, stripped of the earlier certainty. "Ma'am, Judge Carter." The correction came late, almost catching on the second word, and he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because every version of what he could say now felt smaller than the moment required. And Danielle turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, her eyes meeting his in the mirror again, steady, unhurried, and she did not rush to respond. She allowed the silence to hold, because it was no longer empty, it was necessary. And Blake cleared his throat, quietly, his grip tightening again before easing. "There has been an update," he said, the words careful, measured, as if precision alone could soften what had already happened. And Cole shifted in his seat, glancing at the dashboard before looking down briefly, his fingers pressing together in a small, controlled movement. And Danielle's gaze moved between them, not searching, not accusing, simply observing, as if she had seen this moment unfold before in different rooms, under different circumstances, but always with the same pattern, the same quiet shift from certainty to realization. And she finally spoke, her voice low, even, carrying no edge. "Yes," she said, "there has." And the words settled between them without force, without emphasis, but with a clarity that left no room to pretend otherwise. And Blake nodded once, more to himself than to her, before glancing toward the side mirror, then ahead again. And for the first time since the drive began, he eased his foot off the accelerator, the car slowing slightly, merging toward the right lane. Not abruptly, not urgently, but with intention, and the road stretched out ahead under the steady glow of streetlights, each one passing like a quiet reminder that time had not stopped, even if the moment inside the car had. And Cole finally spoke again, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "We should correct this." And the simplicity of the statement made it heavier, not lighter, because correction implied something had gone wrong, and there was no longer any question about that. And Blake gave a small nod, his eyes fixed ahead as he signaled, the click of the indicator sounding louder than expected in the enclosed space. And Danielle watched the movement without reacting, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze now, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, like watching a scale begin to rebalance itself after being tilted too far in one direction. And as the patrol car moved toward the next turn, slowing under the red glow of a traffic light, the moment settled into something quieter, more deliberate, not resolved, not yet, but no longer uncertain, because the truth had already taken its place, and there was no longer any space left to ignore it. The red light held them in place longer than expected, casting a steady glow across the windshield and into the car, bathing everything in a muted red that made the moment feel suspended, as if the world outside had paused to match the stillness inside. And Officer Ryan Blake kept his hands on the wheel, but no longer gripped it the same way, his fingers resting instead of holding, his posture less rigid, as if something inside him had finally loosened, not in relief, but in recognition. And beside him Mason Cole shifted slightly, his eyes moving between the dashboard and the intersection ahead, then briefly to the rearview mirror again, where Danielle Carter sat as she had from the beginning, composed, quiet, unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and the soft ticking of the turn signal filled the space between them, marking time in small, measured intervals, each click echoing the decision they had already begun to make but had not yet completed. And Blake exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate, before finally speaking again, his voice lower now, no longer carrying the authority it had at the start, but something more careful, more aware. "Judge Carter, we are going to pull over and resolve this." And the words felt insufficient even as he said them, like they could not fully account for what had already unfolded. And Danielle tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, her eyes steady as they met his reflection in the mirror, and she did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to settle once more, because now it was not about urgency. It was about precision, about letting each moment arrive exactly as it should, and the light above shifted from red to green. But Blake did not accelerate right away. He hesitated, just for a second, as if recognizing that moving forward meant stepping fully into the consequence of what had already happened, and then he eased the car into motion, slow, controlled, guiding it toward the side of the road where a quiet stretch opened beneath a row of dim streetlights. And the car came to a stop, the engine idling softly as the world outside continued without them, cars passing, headlights sweeping by, unaware of the shift taking place inside. And for a moment no one moved, the silence returning again, but different now, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but filled with the weight of what needed to be done next. And Cole was the first to turn, his body angling slightly toward the back seat, his voice measured but clear. "Ma'am, Judge Carter, we need to remove the restraints." And the words were simple, direct, but carried something deeper beneath them, something closer to acknowledgement than instruction. And Danielle's gaze rested on him for a moment, then shifted to Blake, who had not yet turned around, his eyes fixed ahead as if gathering himself before facing what he already knew was there. And finally he did turn, slowly, his expression controlled but no longer guarded, the earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more human. And he reached for the key, his hand steady now but slower than before, each movement deliberate. And as he stepped out of the car, the cool evening air rushed in briefly, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, grounding the moment in something real again. And Cole opened the rear door, the hinge sounding softer this time, less abrupt, and Danielle shifted slightly, not pulling away, not resisting, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. And as the cuffs were finally released, the small metallic click echoed once more, but this time it sounded different, not final, not closing something, but opening it. And Danielle brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing her wrists lightly, not in discomfort, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had just passed. And she stepped out of the car, standing beneath the dim light, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. And for a brief moment no one spoke, because there were no immediate words that could match the weight of what had already been done. And Danielle looked at them both, her expression calm, her voice even as she finally broke the silence. "What happens next," she said softly, "is the part that matters." And the words settled into the air, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a truth that neither of them could ignore anymore. The night air felt cooler outside the car, carrying a faint breeze that brushed past Danielle Carter's face as she stood under the dim streetlight, her hands now free but still held close together for a moment, as if her body needed a second to catch up with what had just changed. And across from her officer Ryan Blake stood with a posture that no longer carried command, only awareness, his shoulders slightly lowered, his stance no longer squared but uncertain, like someone standing in a place that had shifted beneath him without warning. And Mason Cole remained near the open door, his gaze moving between them, not interrupting, not stepping in, simply witnessing the space that had opened, because this was no longer about procedure, it was about something else entirely, something quieter but heavier. And Danielle lowered her hands slowly, letting them rest at her sides, her expression calm but not distant, present in a way that made the silence between them feel intentional rather than empty. And Blake finally spoke, his voice measured, careful. "Judge Carter, we made a mistake." And the words came out slower than expected, as if each one had to be chosen and placed deliberately, because there was no version of them that could undo what had already happened. And Danielle listened without interruption, her gaze steady on him, not softening, not hardening, simply holding. And when he finished, she did not respond immediately, allowing the weight of the statement to settle fully into the space between them, because acknowledgement, she knew, was only the beginning, not the resolution. And somewhere in the distance a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before disappearing again, leaving them under the quiet glow of the streetlight. And Cole shifted slightly, his voice lower now, more personal than before. "We should take you back, wherever you need to go." And the offer hung there, simple but insufficient, because the situation was no longer about location. It was about consequence. And Danielle's eyes moved from Cole back to Blake, and she spoke, her voice even, unhurried. "You stopped me based on information that was already cleared," she said, not accusing, not raising her tone, but stating a fact that could not be reshaped. And Blake nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes," he said, the word quieter than anything he had said before. And Danielle continued, her tone unchanged. "And you did not verify before acting." And again Blake nodded, slower this time, because each confirmation carried more weight than the last. And Cole looked down briefly, his hand resting against the edge of the car door, his fingers tapping once, then stilling, as if he was processing not just what had happened, but what it meant. And Danielle let the silence return again, not to avoid speaking, but to give the moment its full space. And when she spoke again, her words were softer, but sharper in their clarity. "This is not about me standing here right now," she said, her gaze steady. "This is about how easily it could have been someone else." And the sentence lingered. Not dramatic, not raised, but undeniable. And Blake's eyes shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if he was seeing the situation from a different angle for the first time. And Cole straightened just a little, his expression changing from uncertainty to something closer to understanding. And Danielle took a small step back, creating just a bit more space between them, not distancing herself, but redefining the boundary that had been crossed. And the city moved around them, indifferent to the moment, while inside it something had already shifted, something that would not return to what it had been before. And Blake finally spoke again, his voice lower, steadier now, but changed. "What would you like us to do next?" And this time the question did not carry authority, it carried responsibility. And Danielle looked at him for a moment longer before answering, her voice calm, certain. "First," she said, "you document exactly what happened." And the words settled into place, not as a suggestion, but as a direction that neither of them hesitated to accept. The words settled between them with a quiet finality, and for a moment neither officer moved, not because they did not understand, but because they understood completely. And that made every next step feel heavier, more deliberate, as if even the smallest action now carried consequence. And Officer Ryan Blake gave a slow nod, his posture straightening slightly, not out of authority, but out of acceptance. And he turned toward the patrol car, reaching for the small notebook inside the door compartment, his movements careful, almost precise, like someone aware that every detail now mattered. And Mason Cole followed a second later, retrieving a tablet from the front seat, the screen lighting up against the dim streetlight, casting a pale glow across his face as he began to open the report system. And the soft tapping of his fingers filled the space briefly, a contrast to the silence that had dominated the last few minutes. And Danielle Carter remained where she stood, her gaze steady, not watching their hands, not watching the devices, but watching the shift itself, the transition from assumption to accountability. And it was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but unmistakable to her, because she had seen it before, in courtrooms, in testimonies, in moments where truth replaced narrative. And she let the silence stretch just enough to allow that transition to fully take hold, because rushing it would only weaken it. And Blake glanced up once, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the page, his voice quieter now, more grounded. "Time of stop, 1842, he said aloud, not because it was required, but because saying it made it real, made it fixed. and Cole continued entering details, his expression focused, but different now. Not just recording, but considering, each line carrying weight beyond the form itself. And Danielle took a slow breath, the cool air steady in her lungs, her posture unchanged, her presence calm but firm, like an anchor in a moment that had nearly drifted out of control. And after a few seconds she spoke again, her tone even, measured. "Include the update timestamp on the system flag," she said, not as a correction, but as a necessity, and Cole paused for a fraction of a second before nodding, his fingers adjusting on the screen. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, the title coming naturally now, without hesitation, without question, and Blake continued writing, his pen moving slower than before, more deliberate, as if each word needed to be chosen with care, and the sound of ink against paper was steady, consistent, grounding the moment in something tangible, something that could not be rewritten later, and the passing traffic continued in the background, headlights sweeping across them in brief flashes, but none of it interrupted the focus that had settled over the scene, because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about how it would be remembered, how it would be recorded, and ultimately how it would be judged. And Danielle's gaze moved briefly toward the road, then back to the officers, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes now, not softer, not harsher, but deeper, like she was measuring not just their actions, but their intent. And after a moment Blake stopped writing, his pen hovering just above the page before he looked up again, his voice steady but carrying something new beneath it. "Is there anything else you want included?" he asked, and this time the question was not procedural, it was genuine, and Danielle held his gaze for a second longer before answering, her voice calm, certain. "Yes," she said. "Right that I told you there was a mistake before you verified." And the words landed without force, but with precision, and Blake nodded once, his pen returning to the page, because there was no part of that statement he could deny. And as he wrote it down, the moment settled into something complete, not resolved, not yet, but fully acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the balance had already begun to shift in a way that none of them could reverse. The sound of the pen moving across the page slowed, then stopped, and for a moment Officer Ryan Blake did not lift it, as if the final word he had written carried more weight than the entire report before it. And the quiet hum of passing cars filled the space where his voice might have been, while Mason Cole finished entering the last lines on the tablet, his fingers pausing above the screen before he tapped save, the soft confirmation tone barely audible but final. And Danielle Carter stood a few feet away under the dim streetlight, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, watching not the act of writing, but what it meant, because documentation was not just record, it was responsibility, and once it existed, it could not be undone or reshaped without consequence. And Blake finally exhaled, lowering the pen and closing the notebook slowly, his movements deliberate, like someone setting something down that could not be picked back up the same way again. And he looked up at Danielle, meeting her gaze fully this time, without hesitation, without avoidance. And there was a shift there, not in authority, but in understanding, the kind that comes when certainty gives way to truth. And he spoke, his voice quieter now, but steadier than before. "The report will be submitted exactly as written," he said, and the statement carried no defense, no explanation, only acknowledgement. And Danielle nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, not approving, not dismissing, simply recognizing that the first step had been taken, and the air between them settled into something different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy in a way that felt grounded, like a moment that had found its place, even if it had not yet resolved. And Cole stepped slightly forward, his posture more open than before, his voice measured but sincere. "There will be a review," he added, not as a warning, but as a fact. And Blake did not interrupt, did not correct, because he knew it was true. And Danielle's eyes moved briefly between them before returning to Blake, her expression calm, her voice even as she spoke again. "There should be," she said, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than anything else she had said, because they were not about punishment, they were about process, about a system that only worked if it was willing to examine itself. And Blake gave a small nod, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the act of acknowledging that truth had taken something out of him, something he could not put back, and for a moment none of them spoke, the silence returning. But this time it was not filled with tension or uncertainty. It was filled with recognition, with the understanding that what had happened would not end here, that it would move forward into something larger, something that extended beyond this road, beyond this moment. And Danielle took a small step forward, not toward them, but toward her car parked further down the street, the faint outline visible under another streetlight. And she paused briefly, turning back just enough to meet their gaze one more time. And there was no anger in her expression, no raised voice, only clarity. And she spoke, her tone calm, measured. "You followed procedure," she said. Then after a slight pause, "But you did not follow judgment." And the distinction settled into the air, precise, undeniable, and Blake felt it immediately, not as accusation, but as truth, the kind that did not need to be argued because it was already evident. And Cole remained still, his eyes fixed on Danielle, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. And Danielle held their gaze for one final second before turning fully, walking toward her car with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, her figure moving in and out of the streetlight's glow. And behind her the two officers stood in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they finally understood what had already been said. And as she reached her car and opened the door, the quiet click echoed softly across the road, a simple sound, but one that marked the end of this moment and the beginning of everything that would follow. The sound of her car door closing was soft but precise, echoing just enough to mark the separation between what had happened and what would follow. And as Danielle Carter settled into the driver's seat, she did not start the engine right away, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed forward through the windshield where the road stretched out under the quiet glow of streetlights. And for a moment, she simply sat there, breathing evenly, allowing the weight of the evening to settle without rushing past it. Because moments like this were not meant to be ignored, they were meant to be understood. And across the short distance behind her, Officer Ryan Blake and Mason Cole remained where they stood, neither returning to the patrol car, neither speaking, as if stepping back into motion too quickly would erase something important they had just begun to see. And Blake's eyes followed the outline of Danielle's car, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but reflective, like someone replaying each decision in a sequence he could now see clearly from beginning to end. And Cole shifted slightly beside him, his arms no longer crossed, his stance more open, but still grounded in the same quiet realization. And after a few seconds Blake spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "It should not have taken this long." And Cole did not answer right away, because there was nothing to correct in that statement, only something to accept. And the passing headlights briefly illuminated their faces before fading again, leaving them in the dim consistency of the streetlight. And inside her car Danielle finally moved, adjusting her mirror slightly, not to check behind her, but to align her view forward. And the reflection briefly caught the patrol car in the distance, then shifted away as she centered herself again, and she exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening just slightly around the wheel before relaxing again, her posture steady, her expression composed, because this moment, while heavy, was not new. It was a variation of something she had seen before, something she had addressed before, and something she knew would not end here. And outside Blake took a small step forward, then stopped, as if considering whether to approach again, whether anything more could be said that had not already been made clear. And Cole turned his head slightly toward him, his voice quiet but direct. "We will be reviewed," he said. And Blake nodded once, not resisting, not questioning, because he already understood that part. And the silence returned again, but this time it carried a different weight, not confusion, not tension, but consequence. And Danielle turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum that filled the interior of the car, grounding her in the present. And she placed her hands firmly on the wheel, her gaze fixed ahead, and for a brief second she paused, not hesitating, but acknowledging the moment one final time. And then she eased the car forward, pulling away from the curb with the same calm precision she had carried throughout the entire encounter. And as her car moved down the road, the distance between her and the officers widened slowly, deliberately, until the red glow of her taillights became just another part of the night traffic, and Blake watched until they disappeared from view, his expression unchanged but no longer the same, and Cole remained beside him, silent, both of them standing in the space where something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And as the patrol car sat idle behind them, its lights dim against the larger city, the realization settled fully into place, not as a moment they could move past, but as one that would follow them long after the road had cleared. The next morning arrived without announcement, quiet and steady, the kind of morning that did not reflect what had already begun beneath it. And inside a federal building downtown, sunlight filtered through tall glass windows, casting long, clean lines across polished floors and dark wood panels, and Danielle Carter walked through the hallway with the same composed pace she had carried the night before, her posture straight, her expression calm. But there was something different now, not visible to those who passed her, not spoken, but present in the way the air seemed to hold just slightly longer as she moved through it. And a clerk at the front desk looked up briefly, offering a polite nod, unaware that the quiet woman walking past had already set something in motion that would reach far beyond these walls. And Danielle stepped into her office, closing the door gently behind her, the soft click marking a transition from the outside world into a space where decisions were not just made, but defined. And she placed her bag on the desk, setting it down with care, then paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface as she looked out toward the city beyond the window, where traffic moved in steady lines, unaware of the shift that had already begun. And across town, in a police precinct that felt far less still, Officer Ryan Blake sat at his desk, the same report open in front of him, but now surrounded by additional screens, additional eyes, and a supervisor standing just behind his chair, reading each line in silence. And the room carried a different kind of quiet, not calm, but tense, like something waiting to be acknowledged out loud. And Blake kept his gaze on the report, not avoiding it, not defending it, simply facing it as it existed, because there was no version of it that could be changed now. And Mason Cole stood a few feet away, arms at his sides, his posture steady but his attention focused, listening not just to what would be said, but to how it would be said. And the supervisor finally spoke, his voice controlled, deliberate. "Walk me through the timeline again." And Blake nodded once, his voice even as he began, each word measured, each detail clear, because there was no room now for assumption, only fact. And as he spoke, the reality of the moment extended outward, beyond the room, beyond the report, into something larger, something that would not stay contained. And back in her office, Danielle moved to her desk, pulling a folder toward her, her movements calm, precise, and as she opened it, the pages inside were already organized, already prepared, because what had happened was not unexpected. It was part of a pattern she understood all too well, and she picked up a pen, holding it for a brief second before placing it against the page. And outside her office door, the quiet rhythm of the courthouse continued, footsteps echoing softly, voices low and professional, unaware that within that room a decision was beginning to take shape. And across the city, Blake finished recounting the timeline, the final words settling into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed. And the supervisor remained still for a moment, processing, before nodding once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. And Danielle began to write, her pen moving steadily, each word deliberate, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, because this was not about reaction, it was about action. And as the first page filled, the distance between what had happened and what would follow became smaller, clearer, and unavoidable, and in both places, separated by miles but connected by a single moment, the same realization settled in quietly, that what had begun as a simple stop had already become something far more significant, something that would not fade with time, but move forward, step by step, into a consequence that neither side could ignore. The pen did not stop moving until the final line was complete, and when Danielle Carter set it down, the sound was soft but final, like the closing of something that had already begun long before the ink touched the page. And she sat there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the desk, her gaze steady on the document in front of her, not reading it again, not reconsidering, because there was nothing uncertain about what had been written. and outside her office window the city continued. Its quiet rhythm, cars moving, people passing, unaware that a single moment from the night before had now been transformed into something permanent, something that would move forward on its own. And across town the atmosphere inside the precinct had shifted entirely. The earlier quiet replaced with low conversations, measured tones, and the presence of additional supervisors reviewing details that could no longer be dismissed as routine. And Officer Ryan Blake sat still at his desk, the report, now printed and placed in front of him. No longer just words on a screen, but something tangible, something that existed beyond him. And Mason Cole stood nearby, his posture steady, his expression composed but reflective, both of them no longer reacting, no longer questioning, but understanding that the moment had already moved beyond their control. And in Danielle's office, she finally stood, gathering the document and placing it into a folder, her movements precise, deliberate, and she stepped toward the door, opening it with the same quiet composure she had carried through every part of the process. And as she walked down the hallway, the sound of her heels echoed softly against the polished floor, steady and unhurried, each step marking the continuation of something larger than the moment itself. And when she entered the courtroom, the space responded in a way that required no announcement, no explanation, the subtle shift of posture, the quiet acknowledgement of presence, because authority did not need to be spoken to be understood. And she moved to her seat, placing the folder down in front of her, her hands resting briefly against the surface before she looked out across the room, her expression calm, her gaze clear, and for a brief second the memory of the night before existed there, not as emotion, not as anger, but as context, as something that had shaped the moment without defining it. And she began her work, her voice steady, measured, guiding the proceedings with the same clarity she had shown throughout. And miles away Blake stood from his desk as he was called into an office, the door closing behind him, with a quiet finality, and he paused for a second before stepping fully inside, his posture straight, his expression no longer defensive, because he understood now that what mattered was not what he believed in the moment, but what he had done, and what would follow from it. And the silence that met him was not empty, it was expectant. And back in the courtroom Danielle's voice carried evenly across the space, calm and precise, as if nothing had interrupted its rhythm, and yet everything about it now carried a deeper weight, because it had been tested, not in theory, but in reality. And as the day continued, both paths moved forward, separate but connected by the same moment, one defined by consequence, the other by continuity, and neither could return to what had been before. And as the light from the high windows shifted slightly across the courtroom floor, Danielle paused for just a fraction of a second, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, and in that quiet space between words, the truth settled fully into place, not spoken, but understood, that justice was never about power, never about position, but about the choices made when no one expected to be held accountable. And in the end, that was the part that remained.